Frequency Podcast Network. Stories that matter, podcasts that resonate.
How close is Canada to meeting its $10 a day childcare program target? Ontario, rather than signing a 5-year renewal plan with the feds, signed a 1-year extension instead, with a condition of more money from Ottawa to help cover some costs. Now, currently, Ontarians are paying between $19 and $22 a day for childcare, better than when it was $50, but still not at that $10 mark. The problem? Well, not enough spaces are being built, and if there is space, retention problems and staffing shortages with early childhood educators are prohibiting the spaces from actually being filled. So what's the bigger picture of childcare across Canada in 2025? And will Canadian families actually get the pocket relief the government committed to? I'm Maria Kestane, and today on The Big Story, we're talking to David Macdonald, senior economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives, to discuss the state of childcare accessibility and affordability across the country as Canada reaches towards a comprehensive $10 a day program. David, thank you so much for joining us.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
So, David, we're speaking just a few days after Ontario renewed its agreement with Ottawa for its $19 a day childcare program, which originally was signed back in 2022. This year, though, it had some conditions attached to that signing. Tell us about this year's agreement and what was decided between Ottawa and the province.
Yeah, there's still 3 provinces who haven't signed on to the next 5-year term of these national $10 a day programs. Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario. All the rest of the provinces and territories have signed on to extend the $10 a day national program for another 5 years. The initial term of 5 years ends at the end of March 2026, and so it's coming up very quickly. And so these 3 provinces still have not signed up for renewal, except for Ontario, which has done this 1-year renewal, not a full 5 years like the other provinces and territories. I suppose that's better than the situation in Alberta and Saskatchewan, where they they haven't yet signed up. Presumably they will at some point. The parents there would be pretty upset if they saw their childcare fees skyrocket through the roof again. What's interesting here about Ontario is that the initial plan was that they were to be at $10 a day, an average of $10 a day, by April 2026. The province in previous communications had said that it would get to $12 a day by that time. Not 10, but close. And now it's pretty clear, well, in this latest agreement, it's in fact quite clear that they're not going to get anywhere near that. They're going to stay at the present level of $22 a day. They've been saying in their communications that they're at $19 a day. That's not quite correct. Most parents, middle-class parents who aren't receiving an income subsidy are presently paying $22 a day, will continue to pay $22 a day for the foreseeable future. They will not be paying anywhere near $10 a day.
Right. And so Ontario did request more funding from Ottawa to ensure that they can reach their target of bringing it down to $10 a day. Minister Paul Calandra said $695 million that they received for this extension only covers the 1 year. And that's helping keep away the cost of $19 or, as you said, $22. What do you think Ottawa is looking for from Ontario to give them the rest of the funding?
Well, we have to remember here that the agreements already provided some flexibility to the provinces to not actually set a maximum fee of $10 a day. The text of the original agreements was an average of $10 a day across all fees paid. And so you could end up with a situation in Ontario where somebody in Windsor pays $5 a day and somebody in Toronto pays $15 a day, but on average, everyone is paying $10 a day. And so you could lawyer your way out of $10 a day. It looked like that was actually what Ontario was going to do initially. At this point, it doesn't look like it's anywhere near $10 a day, but it's worth pointing out that we already have 6 out of 13 provinces and territories that are at $10 a day, not lawyering their way to $10 a day. The fee is just $10 a day maximum. And so it's not as if this is some sort of an odd situation. We actually have a whole variety of provinces that are already there. They've accepted the federal money. They're already there. They've signed agreements for the next 5 years. They're at $10 a day. And so clearly, Alberta, Saskatchewan, and Ontario believe that they can squeeze the feds for more money in order to pay more of this and move more towards $10 a day, even though they originally agreed in the original agreements that the money was enough 5 years ago to get them to $10 a day. That's not where Ontario is going to be, and it probably isn't where Alberta is going to be as well. Saskatchewan, interestingly, is at $10 a day, even though it hasn't signed the agreements or the extension of the agreements for the next 5 years.
So what are the other provinces? You said 6 provinces that are doing it, that are at $10, or 5?
Yeah, so Nunavut, Saskatchewan, Manitoba, PEI, Newfoundland and Labrador, and Quebec are already at $10 a day or less. And so it's clearly very possible in a big province like Quebec to take the federal money and have a $10 a day childcare program. Quebec actually has a lot more spaces than Ontario as well as proportion of the population. So clearly there's provinces that are angling for more from the feds, and they believe that the feds are not willing to cancel this program in their province or put it at risk. And so clearly in the case of Ontario, they've managed to squeeze the feds for another year's worth of funding. We'll see what happens after that point, whether it's again, a one-off, 1 year at a time sort of funding situation or not. But most of the provinces, territories have already signed up for the next 5 years. It's only these 3 holdout provinces that clearly want more money.
What are those 6 provinces and territories doing that Ontario, Alberta, and Saskatchewan aren't? Like, what are they getting that maybe our provinces are not?
They're putting more provincial money into it.
And Ontario isn't willing to commit their own?
That's right. I mean, what was interesting about this program was you didn't have to commit your own money to it. I mean, this was exclusively, or could have been exclusively federal money if that's what you wanted as a province. Ontario was one of the provinces actually that had done the least to try to control fees prior to the new national plan. And so as a result, the city of Toronto was the most expensive place in the country to try to find childcare. The GTA suburbs were slightly more affordable, but not by much. And so there's very little actually the province was doing prior to this in terms of trying to keep fees down. Other provinces have done a lot more or were in process of doing that. And so they had more skin in the game to start with. Ontario didn't. And so they're saying, look, feds, if you want to fund this entirely on your own dime, then we want to see more money. That's what they're arguing for here. Other provinces had been spending more of their own money to begin with. And so it was a little bit easier for them to get to this $10 a day point.
Do you think, to kind of push back on that point, do you think Ontario is fair in its place to not spend their own money and rely on the federal government to fully fund this program?
Well, multiple of the provinces had already been much more involved in childcare. And so they'd really let the fees get pretty out of control in Ontario as opposed to other places. I think there's a case that the provinces should have been forced to be involved in this program. That's not the way the program actually initially rolled out. And so it's clearly possible for the provinces to do this. It's unclear who would wear the blame if childcare fees in Ontario went from $22 a day to $50, which is where they were prior to this national plan. And maybe it's a bit of a game of chicken between the province and the feds to see who blinks first. In this case, at least for the first year, it was the feds. They blinked first, as opposed to potentially endangering this program in Ontario.
So the province, it has been able to increase the amount of spaces for childcare centres. That's just one piece of the puzzle, though, here. The next is actually filling them with ECEs and qualified supervisors, which we know recruitment in Canada has been a struggle for the past few years. What is the crux of this recruitment issue here?
Yeah, so in terms of the expansion of new spaces, in the aggregate, the provinces and territories have been creating new spaces. Some have been more successful than others. Certainly, Ontario is basically on target as of the spring of this year in terms of their space creation goals. There's still a bit more to go in terms of space creation for the rest of this year. It's something that we're tracking on an ongoing basis. But they're roughly on track to create the number of spaces they said they were going to create. That's not true everywhere. Places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba really had very ambitious goals in terms of space creation, and they're going to miss them by a country mile. Other places like Alberta have been creating spaces. They're likely to miss their targets that they agreed to. But that being said, there are certainly more spaces. And so, yes, these spaces have to be staffed. This isn't just about capital, but it's also about finding workers. The question, too, though, isn't so much whether these, the creation of these spaces in and of itself, they achieve those goals. But the bigger question is, were those good targets in the first place? So, you created 80,000 new spaces and you can put a press release out on that. But how is that going to differ from the actual experience of parents on the ground? Parents on the ground still say, well, I got to put my kid on 50 wait lists, and the wait lists take 3 years. It really matters what the coverage rate is. Like, how many spaces do you have compared to the number of kids you have in your province, in your city, in your neighborhood, and so on. And so in that regard, the actual raw numbers of spaces created and whether they get them or not is kind of neither here nor there. The real question is, how will this change the picture of accessibility for parents? Will they be able to find a space near them? Now, the federal government, interestingly, they haven't really made this all that public, but they have put this into multiple of these agreements with the provinces in terms of these 5-year childcare plans. They have a specific goal. They want to see 5.9 spaces for every 10 kids that are non-school age, that aren't yet in public school. And so, an important question here is, okay, even if you hit these targets in these agreements, would you get very close to 5.9 spaces per 10 kids or a 59% coverage rate? In the case of Ontario or in the case of Alberta, even if you hit these targets, you will be well behind that. And so the experience of parents will be, okay, you put out a press release, so you made 80,000 spaces in Ontario. I still can't find one. And that's because even at the end of this process, Ontario will only still have about 4 spaces for every 10 kids, not about 6 spaces for every 10 kids, which is the federal target. Places like PEI, Quebec are already at the federal target. Place like Newfoundland and Labrador may get pretty close by next year. So, there's still a ways to go, particularly in the big provinces, Ontario and Alberta, to get enough spaces that parents will actually find it relatively easy to find a space like you would in Quebec or Prince Edward Island.
Right. Yeah. I want to touch on that ECE staffing issue, though, because, ECEs, they're so vital to this entire, experience. And we've been seeing a lot just leaving the field. I want to ask you, is it a problem of ECEs, getting the jobs and then leaving after feeling burnt out or not being paid enough? Or is it the problem of not a lot of people are actually entering these childcare programs, like educational post-secondary programs?
Yeah, it's a problem of retention as much as anything else. So there are plenty of people with the ECE credentials. Certainly we could argue that the pipeline should be bigger, that we should have more programs training ECEs. I think it's a valid point. But the bigger point is that retention is a terrible problem in the childcare sector. Look, it's not a great place to work, right? The pay is low and the working conditions are poor. So often you will start in the sector with very low pay. You'll often start on split shifts. So you're often working before and after school programs. And then the middle of your day, you are not working. So potentially you can fill that with part-time work someplace else. Maybe retail is a common way that happens. But often they're working split shifts and can't find work in the middle of the day. The pay is not particularly good. Now, some of the agreements with the provinces have helped to put a floor on that pay to try to establish a wage grid, which will help to have these folks be paid better. But many of these folks, what will happen is it's also overwhelmingly women. It's 95% women that work this. It's often heavily racialized workforce. It's often new Canadians that work in these areas. For folks that get the ECE designation, they'll commonly work there for a while, usually a decade, in their 20s and early 30s, and then realize in their early 30s that they just can't make a go of it, right? Just can't make enough money in the sector to make a career out of it, and they'll switch to something else. And so certainly retaining ECEs in the sector is difficult when you have other potential areas you could work. Often school boards will employ ECEs, particularly in JK and kindergarten programs, which tend to be much better employment for those workers than working in childcare centers, for instance. And so it becomes a real issue of retention. And it is certainly one of the constraints of filling the capacity of the system, is that now with much lower fees, parents are very interested in childcare. But staffing these licensed spaces, we're seeing the expansion of these licenses, but staffing those spaces is a real challenge. And it's about retention as much as anything else at this point.
The Provincial Auditor General said that although increase in a bit of recruitment has happened, it's still not enough. The government said around 8,500 ECEs need to be hired by 2026. That number is now up to 10,000. How do you think Ontario could start filling those positions?
Well, pay people more is a good way to do it. I mean, one of the ways you could do it is to have folks that have gone on to other work come back to working in childcare centers. And so part of that is higher pay that would attract people back. In some cases, that's often quite challenging just because the pay is so low. Attempting to turn part-time work into full-time work. This was certainly something that there was some experimentation with during the pandemic, in part because you didn't want people working in 3 or 4 different childcare centers trying to piece several part-time jobs together into a full-time job. And so there was some work done by centers to have people work in only one location. And so not have that split shift problem that's very common in childcare with before and after school care. And so changing the employment so that you've got some work during the day for those ECEs, even if it isn't necessarily caring for children, maybe it's administrative work. That's another way to help turn a part-time job into a full-time job that becomes more appealing. You could certainly be ramping up the number of folks graduating with the ECE credentials, but you need to retain them. I mean, this is the big challenge in childcare, is that often the wages are just too low to retain people over the long term out of, say, their 20s.
Now, your institute recently came out with a report covering the relationship between the amount of childcare spaces versus access to those spaces across Canada. Tell us a little bit about the report and what you found.
Yeah, the availability of spaces really is quite different depending on where you are in the country. What we did here is we've actually created a database of every single licensed childcare space in Canada. There's about 1.2 million licensed spaces. We know exactly where they all are, what age groups are in them, and so on. And so we can actually figure out for every city block in Canada how much access do people have to childcare spaces within 5 kilometers of their house in urban areas, or 10 kilometers of their house in rural areas. So how many spaces they have close by, net of what other people living in other neighborhoods close by sort of overlap on those same spaces. And so we've broken up the access into 3 categories. The first is a childcare desert. And so this is a place where there's less than 3 childcare spaces for every 10 kids. So there may be some spaces, but it's going to be pretty competitive. It's going to be long wait lists, going to be hard to find, and so on. There's the second category, sort of the in between. Coverage is okay, but it's not great. And then we've got third category, which is at or above the federal target of 6 spaces per 10 kids. And so you find places like Saskatchewan and Manitoba, half of all kids in those provinces live in a childcare desert. They just have very little access to childcare. You see provinces like Alberta, Ontario, Nova Scotia, Newfoundland, about a third of kids live in a childcare desert. So, better than the prairie provinces of Manitoba and Saskatchewan, but still not amazing. And then you have some provinces like Quebec and Prince Edward Island, where 2/3 of kids actually live in a neighborhood where they've got at or above the federal target. So, they've got 6 spaces per 10 kids. So they've got pretty good coverage there. New Brunswick, about half of kids live in a neighborhood with sort of sufficient access to childcare. And so big difference between where you live, and also big differences based on whether you are rural or urban, which might not be surprising. So if we look at, a place like Ontario, if you're living in a big city, the percentage of kids that live in a childcare desert is about a quarter of kids in big cities in Ontario live in a childcare desert. In a rural area, it's half. It's half of kids in Ontario live in a childcare desert. And so there's certainly a relationship there between how big the city is and your access to childcare. But that being said, it's not impossible to have good childcare in rural areas. So what's interesting is that if you live in rural Quebec, you actually, as a child, you actually have your likelihood of living in a desert is the same as if you live in a big city in Ontario. So it just goes to show that, yeah, it's harder to provide childcare in rural areas, but Quebec does a better job of providing childcare in rural areas than Ontario does in big cities. And so there's a real comparison that you can see across the country in terms of how easy or hard it is to access childcare when it comes to, close by for people where they live.
Yeah, I was reading your GTA specific report, the Greater Toronto Area one, and it found that there was a lot more childcare centers in more affluent downtown neighborhoods. And then, as you said, when you go a bit more to the suburbs and a bit more farther out to rural areas, that's where we're seeing those deserts. For those rural areas, is it because there's not enough like literal space, like facility space, to create the spaces, the centers?
Well, again, it's absolutely possible to provide childcare in rural areas. It's just that in most places they don't do it as well as you find in Quebec or PEI. Childcare is very scalable, and so childcare doesn't have to be offered in a center with 100 or 200 spaces like you'd find in downtown Toronto. It can be offered in a licensed home with 4 spaces. So it's very scalable down to a smaller level. In terms of one of the things that's helped a lot, particularly in northern Quebec, there's a lot of small communities sort of along the northern shore of Quebec. A lot of those are First Nations, and a lot of those First Nations governments have decided that childcare is a priority for them, and so they put in relatively small centers, 5-10 spaces there, enough to serve the local community. But the result is you don't need a lot of space to cover the population because it's not actually that big. And so it is absolutely possible to provide good childcare in rural places or relatively small towns. It's just that in places like Ontario, where you just don't have enough childcare anywhere, big cities, small towns, it doesn't really matter. There's just not going to be as much in rural areas. I should say as well that we did look at the relationship more broadly of the income of parents on a city block compared to their access to childcare. And that relationship wasn't nearly as clear as it was for city size. City size is a pretty clear relationship across the country between, once you get to smaller cities, small towns, they just have worse access. It wasn't necessarily clear on income, in part because you often find childcare in commercial spaces, and people living closest to commercial spaces are often not the highest income. So you think there's a strip mall, a section of strip mall has a childcare center in it. Who's living right next to the strip mall? Well, it's not a $5 million mansion, right? Maybe it's an apartment building. Maybe it's some row housing, which has got folks lower income. And so they actually often have, equal or better access to childcare in some of those settings.
Are we seeing an increase in more home-based childcare centers than, other, publicly funded ones?
That was certainly the promise in several provinces that home childcare would save us. In essence, this was a way that you could rapidly expand. In terms of the expansion so far under this national program, what's pretty clear in the language of the program is that the expansion should be nonprofit. Right, that was the goal. Is that we should be encouraging nonprofits to expand. They're the ones who should be adding spaces. And it's obvious why you'd want to do that, because this program now is primarily funded not by fees, but it's primarily funded by federal government dollars. You don't want those dollars going into a profit margin. If there is excess money there in the system, you want it to go into workers' wages or improvements in facility, as opposed to on the profit side. So that was a clear built-in piece of all these agreements, was a nonprofit expansion. That is not at all what happened. About 60% of all of the new spaces are for-profit spaces in private centers. About 30% are in nonprofit center-based spaces, and about 12% of the expansion has been in homes. Now, the homes, It's a bit questionable whether it's actually a real expansion of 12%, because there was a big segment of the homes population that was unlicensed. Doesn't mean illegal, but it just means that they weren't licensed by a provincial government. And so that a lot of that expansion has likely been homes deciding to move from the unlicensed side of the ledger to the licensed side of the ledger, so they become sort of new homes, quote unquote. But are they actually new spaces in the system? Not really. Many of them were existing already. It's just that they moved to the other side. And so Ontario, for instance, a big part of the expansion actually in Ontario was new homes. Newly licensed homes. Maybe it's not necessarily they were new homes, but newly licensed homes. That's actually an important part of the expansion in Ontario. But a lot of that is probably existing homes that were just moving to the licensed side, because then they could offer $20 a day childcare instead of what they were previously offering, which is probably $50 or $60 a day childcare. And so there's a big incentive for them to move onto the public side, because they could offer their parents much cheaper fees.
David, I want to ask you, do you think Ontario families will ever see a $10 a day childcare program?
I hope so. I mean, this was really the promise. It looked like we were pretty close in Ontario earlier on this year, where there seemed to be some commitment to get to a set fee of $12 a day. And then they were going to sort of lawyer their way to 10 by saying, well, it's an average of this fee and that fee and so on and so forth. So it looked like we were going to get to at least 12 next year. That seems further out of reach now. Certainly when we look at Ontario, Alberta, British Columbia, the big provinces outside of Quebec, it seems unlikely at this point that any of them will get to anywhere near $10 a day come March 2026, even though that's what they signed up for, that's what they received the money for. It looks unlikely at this point that they're going to get there.
All right, we're going to leave it there. David Macdonald, Senior Economist with the Canadian Centre for Policy Alternatives. Thank you so much for this interesting chat today.
Sure thing. Thanks for having me.
And that was The Big Story. If you liked this episode, be sure to share it with a friend or with someone you think may like it. Leave us a comment or send us an email at hello@thebigstorypodcast.ca. You can listen to The Big Story every day on the Seeker app or wherever you get your podcasts. I'm Maria Kestane. Thanks for listening.